Boston. Midnight in the freezing, relentless rain. Keep her, Julian commanded, his voice cold enough to freeze the blood in her veins. She was only ever a temporary asset. Clara's breath hitched. She stared at the mafia king she had foolishly started to love. She was bound to a wooden chair in a shattered cabin, the serrated edge of a hunting knife pressing painfully against her throat. Julian didn't even flinch. His storm-gray eyes were completely flat, empty. He turned his broad shoulders, preparing to walk out into the dark. He was actually throwing her to the wolves to save his shipping empire. But right before he crossed the threshold, the muscle in his jaw flexed. Once. Twice. How did an idealistic archivist end up as bait in a ruthless billionaire's deadly game of chess? Let's go back to the beginning to find out. If you're ready for a high-stakes romance that will leave you breathless, hit that subscribe button, and let's dive into the story. The rain in Boston did not fall. It sliced. It was a freezing, relentless downpour that turned the city streets into slick black mirrors. From the third-floor balcony of the Sterling Tower, the world below looked like a drowning insect. Julian Sterling stood perfectly still. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than most people earned in a decade. The heavy glass doors behind him muted the sound of the charity gala. Inside that golden, amber-lit ballroom, billionaires and politicians drank champagne. They traded favors. They decided the fates of thousands. Julian did not care about any of it. He held a crystal glass of whiskey. He did not drink it. He simply watched the ice melt. For 3 years, Julian had felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no grief, no desire. A psychological block had settled over him like a thick sheet of winter ice. He was the king of the Boston underworld. He controlled shipping lanes, construction empires, and city officials. Yet his own body had betrayed him. The world was utterly gray. Women threw themselves at him. Power offered him every indulgence. He responded to none of it. He was a ghost haunting his own empire. Then he looked down. Across the street, a construction fence blocked off a prime piece of real estate. Julian needed that land. It was the final puzzle piece for a multi-billion-dollar port expansion. Only one building stood in the way, a decaying brick structure, a women's shelter. Tonight, a protest raged outside the gala. The police had pushed the crowd back behind metal barricades. The neon blue lights of the cruiser flashed against the wet pavement. Most of the protesters were huddling under umbrellas, their signs melting in the downpour. But one woman stood at the very front. She held no umbrella. Her thin beige trench coat was entirely soaked. It clung to her slender frame. Honey blonde hair plastered against her cheeks, dripping water down her neck. She held a megaphone, but she wasn't using it. She was arguing directly with a police officer. Julian leaned forward. His hands gripped the cold iron railing of the balcony. He could not hear her words over the storm, but he could see her face. She was furious. Her eyes blazed with a fierce, unbroken defiance. The officer shoved her shoulder. She did not stumble. She stepped right back into his space. She pointed a trembling finger at the Sterling Tower. She was not afraid. She was incandescent with rage. Something cracked inside Julian's chest. It was a sharp, violent jolt, a physical shock. Heat flooded his veins for the first time in 36 months. His breath hitched. His pulse hammered against his throat. The gray world suddenly shattered into blinding, agonizing color. His eyes tracked the slope of her neck, the rise and fall of her chest as she breathed heavy with anger, the rain tracking down her pale skin. His body woke up. It roared. The glass in his hand shattered. Whiskey and blood dripped onto the marble floor. He did not feel the pain. He only felt the overwhelming, desperate hunger clawing at his insides. The balcony doors opened. Marcus stepped out. The massive enforcer wore a black suit and a stoic expression. He noticed the broken glass. He noticed his boss's bleeding hand. But Marcus said nothing. He only waited. Julian did not turn around. His storm-gray eyes remained locked on the woman in the rain. The woman at the barricade. Julian said. His voice was a low, rough rasp. The one in the trench coat. Marcus stepped up to the railing. He looked down. Clara Vance. She runs the shelter on the target property. We have been trying to buy her out for 6 months. She refuses every offer. Bring her to me. Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second. Now, boss. The gala is now. Julian finally turned. His eyes were dark, wild, and predatory. Bring her up here. Do not hurt her. Do not let anyone else touch her. Bring her to me. Marcus nodded once. He disappeared back into the ballroom. Julian wiped the blood from his hand with a pristine white handkerchief. He stepped back inside. The heat in his blood was intoxicating. He felt dangerous. He felt alive. 10 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of his private office swung open. Clara Vance was shoved inside. The doors clicked shut behind her. She stumbled, catching her balance on a leather sofa. She was shivering. Water dripped from her coat onto the priceless Persian rug. She looked around the massive, dimly lit office. Walls of ancient books, a roaring fireplace, and him. Julian sat behind a massive mahogany desk. The firelight cast sharp, chiaroscuro shadows across his face. He watched her. He analyzed every trembling inch of her body. You are ruining my rug. Miss Vance, he said. His voice was velvet wrapped around a blade. Clara spun to face him. Her green eyes widened, taking in his imposing figure. She recognized him instantly. The CEO, the billionaire, the monster trying to destroy her life's work. Julian Sterling, she breathed. Her voice was shaking, but not from fear, from cold and fury. Did you have your thugs drag me up here to intimidate me? It won't work. We are not selling the shelter. Julian stood up. He moved slowly. Deliberately, he walked around the desk, his tall frame dominating the room. He stopped 3 feet away from her. The scent of her hit him. Rainwater, cheap soap, and something uniquely her. Something fresh and vibrant. His jaw tightened. I am not here to negotiate the sale of your building, Julian said. Clara frowned, confused. Then what do you want? Julian reached into his jacket. He pulled out a folded document. He dropped it onto the glass coffee table between them. I want you. Clara froze. The silence in the room was absolute. Only the crackle of the fire broke the quiet. Excuse me. That is a contract, Julian said smoothly. He paced slowly around her, observing her like a prized mare. You are an archivist by trade. You have a master's degree in historical preservation. I need a personal archivist for my family's estate. You will move into my home. You will live there for 1 year. You will be at my disposal. Day and night. Clara stared at him in horror. You are out of your mind. I would never work for you. Julian stopped in front of her. He looked down into her defiant eyes. If you sign that contract, I will permanently halt the demolition of your shelter. I will fully endow the property. I will fund it for the next 20 years. Your women will be safe. Your legacy will be secure. Clara stopped breathing. 20 years of funding. The shelter was currently 3 weeks away from foreclosure. She was drowning in debt. She had skipped meals to pay the heating bill. And if I refuse, she whispered. Then the bulldozers arrive at dawn tomorrow, Julian said coldly. The police will drag your residents out into the freezing rain, and I will build a parking garage over their beds. Clara's hands balled into fists at her sides. She trembled with rage. This man was a devil. He was holding the lives of 50 vulnerable women hostage just to acquire a pet. Human dignity doesn't have a price tag, Mr. Sterling, Clara said loudly. Her voice echoed in the cavernous office. You can buy buildings. You can buy politicians. But you cannot buy the right to own a person. Julian stepped closer. The heat of his body radiated against her damp skin. He reached out. His knuckles brushed against her cold, wet cheek. Clara flinched, but she did not step back. I just did, he murmured. He picked up a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen from his desk. He held it out to her. The ink inside was a deep, blood red. Clara looked at the pen. She looked at the contract. She thought of the women sleeping in the shelter, women who had nowhere else to go, women who relied on her to protect them. She was their only shield. She reached out with a shaking hand. She took the pen. She bent over the glass table. She signed her name at the bottom of the page. The red ink bled into the thick paper. Julian watched her. A dark, triumphant satisfaction settled deep in his chest. He took the pen from her trembling fingers. He leaned in, his lips hovering mere inches from her ear. He could feel her pulse racing. "Welcome to your gilded cage." "Miss Vance," he whispered. The Sterling estate was not a house. It was a fortress. It sat on 40 acres of private land, surrounded by wrought iron gates and stone walls. The mansion itself had 80 rooms. Clara stood in the grand foyer, clutching her small, battered suitcase. The floor was polished white marble. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings. The air smelled of expensive floor wax and old money. Every single inch of it felt like a beautifully decorated tomb. A stiff, elderly housekeeper named Mrs. Gable led Clara up the sweeping staircase. They walked down a long, silent hallway lined with oil paintings of stern men. Mrs. Gable opened a heavy oak door. "Your quarters, Miss Vance," the housekeeper said. Her tone was polite but entirely devoid of warmth. Clara stepped inside. The room was larger than her entire apartment. A massive four-poster bed sat in the center. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the manicured gardens, currently drowned in gray morning fog. A wardrobe was already filled with designer clothes in her exact size: silk blouses, cashmere sweaters. The implication made her stomach turn. Julian had been planning this. "Mr. Sterling expects you in the library in 1 hour," Mrs. Gable said. Closing the door, Clara dropped her suitcase. She walked to the window and pressed her forehead against the cold glass. She was a prisoner. She had sold her freedom to save her shelter. Now she had to survive the devil's lair. An hour later, Clara found the library. It was a cavernous, 2-story room. Ladders rolled along massive bookshelves. Dust motes danced in the pale light filtering through the stained glass windows. In the center of the room sat a massive table, piled high with leather-bound ledgers, yellowed letters, and dusty journals. Julian sat in a high-backed leather chair, reading a document. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He looked up as she entered. His gray eyes pinned her in place. "Sit," he commanded. Clara walked to the table. She sat opposite him. She kept her spine perfectly straight. "Your task is to digitize and organize the Sterling family history," Julian said, gesturing to the mountain of paper. 200 years of shipping manifests, property deeds, and correspondence. You will separate the relevant historical data from the trivial. Clara looked at the documents. "You want me to archive your legitimate history." Julian's eyes narrowed slightly. "Is there another kind of history you are implying?" "Miss Vance, I know who you are." "Mr. Sterling," Clara said quietly. "I know how you acquire your properties. I know why the police at the protests wouldn't look you in the eye. You want me to build a pristine paper trail for a family built on blood." The silence in the library stretched. The tension was thick enough to cut. Julian stared at her. Most people cowered when they spoke to him. They stammered. They looked at the floor. Clara met his gaze with unyielding green eyes. A slow, dangerous smirk played on Julian's lips. "You have a sharp tongue. Be careful it does not cut you." "I am here to do a job," Clara said, opening the first ledger. "I will preserve your history. But I will not pretend you are a saint." Days turned into a week. A tense, rigid routine established itself. Clara spent her days in the library. She meticulously scanned and cataloged the fragile documents. The work was genuinely fascinating. She loved the smell of old paper. She loved uncovering the secrets of the past. But her nights were a psychological battlefield. Dinner was served at 8 o'clock sharp in the formal dining room, a table long enough to seat 20 people. Julian sat at the head. Clara sat at his right. They were always alone. The meals were silent, suffocating affairs. Julian would watch her eat. He observed her every movement. He kept a tense, calculated physical distance. He was savoring the agonizing return of his senses. He wanted her, but he was a predator practicing patience. Instead of physical touch, they sparred with words. "You believe humanity is inherently good," Julian said one evening, cutting into a steak. It is a naive worldview. People are driven by self-interest and fear, nothing else. People are driven by connection. Clara shot back, putting her fork down. If you only rule through fear, you are not a leader. You are just a tyrant waiting for a revolution. Julian paused. He looked at her over the rim of his wineglass. He realized her mind was as captivating as her defiance. She was brilliant. She challenged him. She was the first person in years who did not bore him to death. But Clara was not just arguing. She was observing. She noticed the dark circles under Mrs. Gable's eyes. She noticed the young maid, Maria, limping slightly as she served the soup. She noticed that the staff worked 15-hour shifts without a break. The next evening, Clara arrived at the dining room. The table was set. Julian was already seated. The food was brought out. A lavish spread of roasted duck and winter vegetables. Clara sat down. She folded her napkin in her lap. She did not pick up her fork. Julian watched her for 2 full minutes. Is the food not to your liking? I am not hungry, Clara said evenly. Julian set his knife down. The metallic clink echoed loudly. Eat, Clara. No, Julian's jaw tightened. Are you throwing a childish tantrum? Eat your dinner. I spoke with Maria today, Clara said, her voice steady but laced with steel. She has a fever. She asked Mrs. Gable for the day off to see a doctor. Mrs. Gable told her that sick days are unpaid, and if she misses her shift, she will be penalized half a week's wages. Maria cannot afford to lose that money, so she is working with a fever. Julian looked entirely unbothered. That is standard estate policy. The staff are compensated well for their time. It is exploitation, Clara said. You have billions of dollars. You live in an 80-room mansion, and you penalize a maid for being human. I will not eat your food while the people serving it are treated like machinery. Julian stared at her. His eyes darkened. You are fasting for a maid. I am refusing to participate in a system that strips people of basic rights. Clara corrected. I will not eat tonight. I will not eat tomorrow. I will starve at this table before I watch another person suffer for your convenience. Julian stood up abruptly. His chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. He walked around the table. He stopped right behind her chair. Clara held her breath, but she did not flinch. He leaned down. His chest brushed against her back. The heat of him seeped through her silk blouse. You are testing my patience. Little bird. Then grant them fair labor rights, Clara whispered, her heart hammering. Paid sick leave. Standard working hours. Give them their dignity. Julian closed his eyes. The scent of jasmine and rain filled his lungs. He was infuriated by her stubbornness. He was completely addicted to her fire. She was entirely selfless. It was a concept he could not comprehend, yet he could not look away from it. Fine, Julian rasped softly against her ear. The policies will be changed tomorrow morning. Now, pick up your fork and eat. Clara exhaled a shaky breath. She picked up her fork. Julian walked back to his seat. He watched her eat, completely shaken by the realization that this fragile archivist had just bent the King of Boston to her will without raising a weapon. The next afternoon, Clara was back in the library. She was sorting through a box of documents Julian had explicitly told her to ignore. He claimed they were just old tax receipts. But Clara's research skills were too sharp. She recognized a pattern in the dates. She pulled out a small, black leather ledger hidden at the bottom of the box. She opened it. The pages were filled with handwritten numbers, massive sums of money, offshore account routing numbers, and beside them, names, city councilmen, police commissioners, judges. Clara's breath caught in her throat. This was not legitimate family history. This was the blueprint of the syndicate's illegal network. This was the proof of bribery and corruption that could tear Julian's empire to the ground. She turned the page. Her finger traced down a list of monthly payouts. It stopped on a name that made her blood run cold. District Attorney Robert Hayes, the DA, the man Clara had trusted. The man who had spoken at her shelter's fundraisers. He was on Julian's payroll. The entire city was a lie. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the mahogany desk, blocking the pale light from the window. Clara froze. She slowly lifted her head. Standing in the doorway was an older woman. She wore a flawless tweed suit and pearls. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed. Her posture was rigid. Her eyes were exactly like Julian's, but devoid of any heat. They were pure, calculating ice. Victoria Sterling, Julian's aunt, the true viper of high society. Victoria stepped into the library. Her heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor. She looked at Clara. She looked at the black ledger sitting open on the desk. A slow, terrifying smile spread across Victoria's face. Well, well, Victoria purred, her voice dripping with poison. It seems the little archivist has found something she shouldn't have. The air in the library grew instantly stagnant. As if the oxygen had been sucked out of the cavernous room the moment Victoria Sterling stepped across the threshold. Clara froze, her hand still hovering over the black leather ledger, the damning list of names, the offshore accounts, the meticulous records of a criminal empire disguised as a legitimate shipping conglomerate. It was all exposed under the pale, dusty light of the stained glass windows. Victoria did not raise her voice. She did not rush forward to snatch the book away. She simply walked toward the mahogany desk with the slow, deliberate grace of an apex predator that knew its prey had nowhere to run. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor, each sound sharp and rhythmic, echoing in the vast silence of the library. Clara's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but she forced herself to stand her ground. She did not close the ledger. She did not cower. She met Victoria's calculating, icy gaze with a defiant lift of her chin. Victoria stopped at the edge of the desk. Up close, the resemblance to Julian was undeniable, but where Julian's coldness hid a volatile, dangerous heat. Victoria's eyes were completely devoid of warmth. They were the eyes of a woman who had spent decades ruthlessly pruning a family tree, cutting away anyone and anything that threatened the Sterling legacy. She reached out with a hand adorned in flawless, vintage diamonds and gently closed the black ledger. The soft thud of the leather cover sounded like a judge's gavel. Curiosity is a dangerous trait for a temporary guest, Miss Vance, Victoria said, her voice a smooth, cultured purr that carried a terrifying weight. My nephew has always had a penchant for collecting broken things, stray dogs, ruined businesses, and now a naive little archivist who fancies herself a savior. He finds your defiance amusing. He thinks your moral outrage is a refreshing change of pace from the sycophants in our circle. But you must understand something very clearly. You are not a fixture in this house. You are a passing phase. Fever he needed to sweat out. Clara gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles turning white. I am not here because I want to be, Mrs. Sterling. I am here because your nephew blackmailed me. If he is suffering from a fever, he is the one who tied me to his bedside. I have no interest in your family's legacy, other than surviving my time in this prison. A terrifyingly serene smile touched Victoria's lips. She picked up the black ledger, holding it casually against her tweed suit. Prison. Oh, my dear girl, you have no idea what a prison is. You think because Julian feeds you on fine china and buys you silk blouses that you have somehow earned a place at the table. You think you are safe because you signed a piece of paper. But pieces of paper are so very fragile. They burn, they tear. They can be invalidated by the stroke of a pen. You negotiated for the safety of your little women's shelter, a noble if pathetic gesture. But Julian's protection only extends as far as his attention span. And the problem with women like you is that you do not understand how true power operates. You think power is a man shouting in a boardroom or firing a gun. True power is quiet. It is a phone call made over afternoon tea. It is a zoning law changed in a closed-door committee. It is the ability to erase someone from the map without ever leaving a fingerprint. Victoria turned and walked slowly toward the heavy oak doors, not looking back. Enjoy the library, Miss Vance. Read the histories. But remember that history is written by the victors, and the Sterlings have never lost. The doors clicked shut, leaving Clara alone in the oppressive silence. A cold dread settled deep in her stomach. Julian's violence was outward, volatile, and direct. But Victoria's threat was a suffocating blanket. over the next few days. The atmosphere in the estate shifted. Julian was away on business, dealing with a port strike in another state. Clara was left entirely isolated in the massive mansion. Mrs. Gable and the staff avoided her, their eyes darting away whenever she entered a room. The silence of the 80 rooms began to press down on her chest. She spent her hours pacing her grand bedroom, looking out at the manicured gardens, feeling the walls of her gilded cage shrinking. She tried to call the shelter, but the estate's phone lines were restricted. She was completely cut off from the outside world. On the fourth day of Julian's absence, Clara was sitting in the formal living room, staring blankly at the massive flat-screen television playing a local news channel. She wasn't really watching, just desperate for the sound of another human voice. The anchor was discussing local real estate developments. Suddenly, a familiar image flashed on the screen: the crumbling brick facade of the women's shelter. Clara sat up, her blood turning to ice. She grabbed the remote and turned up the volume, her hands shaking uncontrollably. In a surprise emergency session this morning, the news anchor said, looking gravely into the camera, the Boston City Council voted unanimously to permanently revoke the zoning and safety permits for the Hope House Women's Shelter in the downtown district, citing severe structural deficiencies and a sudden failure to meet newly enacted municipal safety codes. The city has condemned the building. The 50 residents were evacuated this morning under police supervision. Demolition crews have already moved onto the site. City officials claim the expedited demolition is necessary for public safety, though critics note the land is adjacent to the proposed Sterling Syndicate port expansion. The screen cut to live footage. Clara watched, paralyzed, as police officers ushered women she knew by name, women she had counseled, fed and protected out into the cold streets, carrying their belongings in trash bags. And then, the camera panned to the heavy machinery. A massive yellow excavator tore into the side of the brick building. The roof collapsed in a plume of gray dust. The sign that Clara had painted with her own hands was crushed under the treads of a bulldozer. Clara dropped the remote. It shattered against the hardwood floor. A choked gasp ripped from her throat. She slid off the sofa, her knees hitting the floor hard. She couldn't breathe. The air felt like shattered glass in her lungs. She had sold herself. She had surrendered her body, her autonomy, her entire future to a monster just to keep those women safe. She had signed a contract in blood-red ink, and it meant nothing. Julian had promised to protect the shelter, but Victoria had bypassed him entirely. Victoria had made a few quiet phone calls, pulled a few political strings, and legally erased Clara's life's work in a single morning. The sheer, overwhelming reality of institutional wealth crashed down upon her. She was a single, powerless woman trying to fight an ocean with her bare hands. She was nothing. Her sacrifice was nothing. Clara curled into herself on the floor, pressing her face into her hands as violent sobs tore through her body. The despair was absolute. It was a crushing, physical weight that pinned her to the floorboards. She had lost. The women were back on the streets. The shelter was rubble. She was trapped in this mansion for a year, a prisoner to a man who couldn't even uphold his end of the bargain. The heavy doors of the living room swung open. Heavy footsteps crossed the floor. Clara couldn't stop crying. She didn't care who saw her broken. She felt a presence towering over her. Julian, he had returned from his trip. He stood there in his charcoal suit, looking down at her trembling form. He looked at the television screen, where the news was now showing aerial footage of the demolished shelter. His jaw clenched so tight the muscle ticked wildly. His storm-gray eyes darkened into something utterly terrifying. It was not pity. It was absolute, unadulterated fury. But he did not yell. He did not mock her weakness. Julian knelt on the floor beside her. He reached out, his large hand surprisingly gentle as he gripped her shoulders and pulled her upright. Clara slumped against him, her tears soaking the lapel of his expensive suit. He let her cry. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was her ragged breathing and the distant voice of the news anchor. Then Julian reached to the small of his back. He pulled out a heavy, silver revolver. He placed the cold metal into Clara's trembling hands, wrapping his warm fingers over hers to steady the weapon. "Dry your tears, Clara," Julian whispered, his voice a low, lethal rasp against her ear. "Crying changes nothing. Blood changes everything. Wash your face. Let's go hunt the politician who signed the demolition order." The drive into the city was a blur of neon lights and heavy rain. Clara sat in the passenger seat of Julian's armored SUV, the silver revolver resting heavy and cold in her lap. Marcus drove in silence. Julian sat beside her, radiating a dangerous, coiled energy. He had made good on his promise. They were heading to the private residence of Councilman Thomas Reed, the man who had suddenly drafted and pushed the emergency zoning revocation. Clara's mind was a chaotic storm. She was an archivist, a pacifist, a woman who dedicated her life to healing abuse, not inflicting it. But as she gripped the gun, a dark, venomous part of her, a part she didn't know existed, wanted to see the councilman bleed. She wanted him to feel the exact same helplessness the women of her shelter felt when they were thrown onto the street. When they arrived at the upscale suburban home, Marcus bypassed the security gates with frightening ease. Julian led Clara through the rain, kicking the front door open with a splintering crash. The house was lavish, reeking of new money. They found Councilman Reed in his study, pouring a glass of scotch. The glass shattered on the floor as he turned, his face draining of all color when he saw Julian Sterling standing in his doorway. Looking like the Grim Reaper in a tailored suit, "Julian," Reed stammered, backing away until he hit his mahogany desk. "I can explain. Victoria, your aunt, she told me you were restructuring. She said the property needed to be cleared for the port. She promised me a seat on the state planning committee. I didn't know you wanted the building preserved. I swear to God. Julian, I didn't know." Julian did not say a word. He stepped to the side, gesturing for Clara to step forward. Clara moved into the room, her hands shaking as she raised the heavy silver revolver, pointing it directly at the councilman's chest. Reed's eyes widened in sheer terror. He looked at the beautiful, soaked woman holding his life in her trembling hands. "You threw 50 women onto the street," Clara said, her voice cracking, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "Women who were hiding from abusers, women who had nothing. You destroyed their sanctuary for a committee seat. Please," Reed begged, holding his hands up. "I'll fix it. I'll pass a new ordinance. I'll find them housing. Just put the gun down. Please." Clara stared at him. She looked at his terrified, pathetic face. She looked at Julian, who was watching her with an intense, burning pride, waiting for her to pull the trigger and cross the line into his world. He wanted her to become a monster so she wouldn't feel so alone in the dark. But as Clara held the gun, the heavy weight of the metal grounded her. She realized that pulling the trigger wouldn't rebuild the shelter. It wouldn't save the women. It would only chain her to Julian forever. It would make her exactly like them, a person who believed power came from violence. Clara slowly lowered the gun. She took a shuddering breath. "I am not a murderer. Julian," she whispered, handing the revolver back to him. "He isn't worth my soul." Julian took the gun. His expression was unreadable, a mix of disappointment and profound, terrifying respect. He looked at Reed. "You have 24 hours to resign from the council in disgrace. If I ever see your name on a ballot again, I won't bring her next time. I will come alone." As they walked out into the rain, Clara realized two things with crystal clarity. First, Julian Sterling was a man who would burn the world down to avenge a single tear she shed. And second, if she stayed in this world, the proximity to absolute power would eventually rot her soul. She had to escape, not just for her freedom, but to save whatever was left of her humanity. She could not rely on Julian's violent protection. She had to use the only weapon she truly mastered, the law. The next morning, Clara returned to the library with a renewed, desperate focus. She was no longer just archiving family history. She was hunting for an exit strategy. The black ledger Victoria had caught her with had been removed, but Clara had a photographic memory for documents. She remembered the names, the dates, the account routing numbers. But more importantly, she began researching the specific legal parameters of her contract. She spent days poring over state statutes, federal human trafficking laws, and precedents regarding contracts signed under duress. The contract Julian had forced her to sign was a masterpiece of legal manipulation, disguised as a highly compensated employment agreement. But no contract could legally enforce indentured servitude, especially when signed under the direct threat of destroying a charitable institution. She needed a lawyer, a prosecutor powerful enough to stand up to the Sterling Syndicate and clean enough not to be bought. Her mind kept returning to the name she had seen in the Black Ledger, District Attorney Robert Hayes. It was a massive risk. Hayes' name was in Julian's book, but Clara desperately reasoned with herself. The ledger only listed names and accounts. It didn't explicitly detail the services rendered. Hayes was currently running a highly publicized, aggressive campaign against organized crime in Boston. He was on television every night, talking about cleaning up the streets. Clara convinced herself that perhaps Hayes was working undercover, or perhaps Julian was paying him extortion money, and Hayes was a victim too. She needed to believe that the justice system wasn't entirely rotten. She needed a lifeline. Clara wrote a meticulous, detailed letter. She outlined the terms of her confinement, the blackmail regarding the shelter, and cited the specific legal codes that rendered the contract null and void. She requested a federal warrant for her extraction and a nullification order. She sealed the letter in an unmarked envelope. Now she needed to get it out of the fortress. She turned to Maria, the young maid she had defended at the dinner table. Maria was deeply grateful to Clara for securing the staff's labor rights. When Clara approached her in the laundry room, slipping the envelope and a diamond necklace Julian had gifted her into the maid's apron, Maria's eyes went wide. "Take this to the district attorney's office," Clara whispered urgently. Looking over her shoulder, "Hand it directly to Robert Hayes. Tell no one. Keep the necklace. Just please, get this out of the house." Maria nodded, her face pale but resolute. "I will do it, Miss Vance. Tonight when I go off shift, for the next 3 days." Clara lived in a state of agonizing anticipation. Every time a car crunched on the gravel driveway, her heart leaped into her throat. Every time Julian looked at her across the dining table, she wondered if he knew. But Julian seemed entirely preoccupied with the fallout of the councilman's sudden resignation and the ensuing political vacuum. He was tense, pacing the halls late at night, making hushed, angry phone calls. Clara packed a small duffel bag with her original, worn clothes and hid it beneath her massive bed. She was ready. On Friday evening, Julian informed her they were hosting a lavish dinner party. It was a strategic move to project stability to his business partners after the recent political chaos. The dining room was transformed. Crystal glasses gleamed under the chandeliers. Massive floral arrangements of white roses filled the air with a heavy, sweet perfume. Clara was forced to wear a breathtaking, emerald green silk gown that clung to her curves, a physical manifestation of her status as Julian's prized possession. As the guests arrived, senators, shipping magnates, and elite socialites, Clara played the role of the perfect, silent companion. She stood by Julian's side, sipping champagne she couldn't taste, her eyes constantly darting toward the grand foyer. She had calculated the timing. If Hayes had received the letter and secured the warrant, he would strike tonight, when the estate was full of witnesses, preventing Julian from using violence to stop the extraction. At exactly 9 o'clock, as the guests were moving toward the dining table, the heavy front doors opened. Clara's heart stopped. Walking into the foyer, flanking the butler, was District Attorney Robert Hayes. He wore a sharp tuxedo, his silver hair perfectly styled. He held a leather briefcase in his hand. This was it. The cavalry had arrived. Clara felt a massive, dizzying wave of victorious relief wash over her. She had done it. She had outsmarted the Mafia King. She took a step forward, ready to meet Hayes, ready to follow him out the door to freedom. Hayes stepped into the grand hall. He saw Clara. For a fleeting, microscopic second, Their eyes met. And in that second, Clara saw no heroism. She saw no justice. She saw a man deeply, profoundly ashamed. Hayes broke eye contact. He walked right past Clara, ignoring her completely. He walked straight toward Julian, who was standing by the fireplace, a glass of bourbon in his hand. Julian did not look surprised. He looked supremely, terrifyingly bored. "Julian," Hayes said, his voice tight. He opened his leather briefcase. He pulled out a familiar, unmarked envelope. Clara's envelope, the one she had given to Maria. He held it out. "This was delivered to my office by one of your domestic staff. I thought you would prefer to handle internal personnel issues yourself." Julian took the envelope. He didn't even look at it. He looked across the room, his storm gray eyes locking onto Clara. The air in Clara's lungs vanished. The room spun, the glittering chandeliers, the wealthy guests, the white roses. It all blurred into a sickening nightmare. Hayes wasn't undercover. He wasn't a victim. He was exactly what the Black Ledger said he was. A bought and paid for lapdog of the Sterling Syndicate. He had taken her desperate plea for help and handed it directly to her captor. The betrayal was total. It was absolute. She had thrown her only lifeline to a shark. Julian stepped forward. The guests fell silent. Sensing the sudden drop in temperature, Julian walked toward a heavy silver candelabra sitting on a side table. He held Clara's unopened letter over the open flame. The paper curled, blackened, and caught fire. The bright orange flames licked up the sides of the envelope, turning Clara's meticulously researched legal arguments, her desperate hopes, and her entire future into gray ash. He dropped the burning remains onto a silver tray. Julian walked slowly toward Clara. The crowd parted for him. Clara could not move. Her legs felt like lead. She was trapped in the emerald gown. Trapped in the room. Trapped in a world where the law was just another commodity to be purchased. Julian stopped inches from her. He reached out and gently brushed a stray lock of honey blonde hair behind her ear. His touch was burning hot against her freezing skin. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her temple. "Did you really think I didn't own the law?" "Clara," he whispered, his voice a dark, velvet promise of inescapable ruin. "You can run to the police. You can run to the courts. You can run to the edge of the earth. But every door you knock on will be opened by a man who answers to me. You are mine, and you will never, ever escape." They say monsters do not bleed. They say creatures forged in the dark are impervious to the fragile, tearing vulnerabilities of mortal flesh. But the blood staining my hands was very real, very warm, and undeniably human. The suffocating reality of the dinner party had settled into Clara's bones like lead. 3 days had passed since District Attorney Robert Hayes had handed her desperate plea for freedom directly into Julian's hands. 3 days since Julian had burned her letter over a candle, proving with absolute, terrifying finality that he owned the very laws she had hoped would save her. She was a ghost walking through the cavernous halls of the Sterling estate, entirely stripped of her hope. Julian had watched her retreat into silence, his storm-gray eyes tracking her every movement with a dark, calculating intensity. He had broken her resistance. But he seemed entirely unsatisfied with the hollow victory. On the 4th evening, Julian did not allow her to retreat to her room after their silent dinner. Instead, he ordered Marcus to bring the armored SUV to the front steps. He forced Clara into the back seat, his presence a suffocating weight beside her in the enclosed leather interior. He refused to tell her where they were going. He simply stated that it was time she understood the true perimeter of the world she now belonged to. The drive took them far from the manicured lawns of the estate, deep into the industrial heart of the Boston Harbor. The rain was a relentless, driving sheet of water that blurred the neon streetlights into streaks of sickly yellow and violent red. Massive shipping containers loomed in the darkness like iron monoliths. The docks were desolate, a sprawling labyrinth of rusted metal and deep shadows. "This is the foundation," Julian said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence of the car. He looked out the rain-streaked window, his jaw tight. You look at the charity galas and the politicians and you see power, but this is the artery. Whoever controls the ports controls the city. Hayes understands this. My aunt understands this. You are the only one who still believes the world runs on morality. Clara, it runs on steel. And it runs on blood. Before Clara could formulate a reply, the world exploded. The deafening roar of a heavy-caliber rifle shattered the night. The SUV's reinforced front tire blew out with a violent crack, sending the massive vehicle careening violently to the left. Clara screamed as she was thrown against the door, the seatbelt violently biting into her collarbone. Marcus wrestled with the steering wheel, his massive arms straining as the armored vehicle slammed into a stack of wooden pallets, splintering them into 1,000 pieces before grinding to a halt against a brick warehouse wall. Down, Julian roared. He moved with a speed that defied his large frame, throwing himself across the back seat and pinning Clara to the floorboards just as a second barrage of gunfire erupted. The armored glass of the windows spider-webbed, turning opaque white as high-velocity rounds hammered against the reinforced plating. The deafening staccato of automatic weapons echoed off the metal shipping containers, a relentless, terrifying cacophony. Rival faction. Hayes's mercenaries. Marcus shouted over the din, kicking his door open and rolling out into the rain. He instantly returned fire with a heavy assault rifle he had pulled from beneath the console, the muzzle flashes illuminating the dark alley in strobe light bursts of violence. We can't stay in the vehicle. The armor will fail, Julian yelled, his body still covering Clara's. He grabbed her by the arm, his grip like a steel vise. When I open this door, you run to the warehouse entrance. You do not stop. You do not look back. Do you understand me? Clara was paralyzed, her ears ringing, her breath coming in shallow, terrified gasps. Julian shook her roughly. Clara, look at me. She met his wild, predatory eyes in the darkness. I understand. She choked out. Julian kicked the heavy door open. The cold rain and the deafening roar of gunfire flooded the cabin. He hauled her out, shoving her behind the meager cover of a rusted dumpster. Marcus was laying down a heavy suppressing fire, forcing the unseen attackers to duck behind their vehicles. Move, Julian commanded. Clara ran. She scrambled over the wet pavement, her breath burning in her lungs, the rain blinding her. She reached the heavy iron door of the abandoned warehouse and threw her weight against it. It groaned open. She tumbled inside into the pitch black, cavernous space. A second later, Julian burst through the door behind her, slamming it shut and dropping a massive iron crossbar into place. But as the heavy metal bar clanged into its brackets, Julian did not turn around. He stood rigidly against the door, his breathing suddenly shallow and ragged. Julian, Clara whispered, the darkness pressing in around them. He took one step forward and collapsed to his knees. A low, guttural groan escaped his lips. He pitched sideways, hitting the concrete floor with a heavy thud. Clara scrambled toward him, her hands frantically searching in the dark. Her fingers brushed against his tailored charcoal suit jacket, and then she felt it, a hot, slick wetness soaking through the expensive wool. She pulled her hand back, even though she couldn't see it. The metallic, copper scent of blood filled the air. You're shot, Clara gasped, panic clawing at her throat. Julian let out a harsh, bitter laugh that ended in a wet cough. Through the door panel, armor-piercing round. Hit my shoulder. Maybe the lung. Clara's eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom. The moonlight, filtering through the shattered skylights, cast a pale, ghostly glow over the warehouse floor. Julian was lying on his back, his face completely drained of color. His hand was pressed against his upper chest, blood weeping through his fingers at a terrifying rate. Outside, the gunfire intensified. Marcus was holding them off, but he was entirely outnumbered. Julian reached out with a trembling, blood-soaked hand and grabbed Clara's wrist. There is a back exit, he rasped, his eyes struggling to focus on her face. Follow the wall to the left. You will find a fire door. It leads to the rail yard. You can lose them in the train cars. Clara stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. Go, Julian commanded, his voice losing its iron edge, fading into a desperate whisper. This is your chance, Clara. You wanted your freedom. Take it. Let me bleed out on this floor. And the contract dies with me. Hayes will take over the ports. But he won't look for you. You will be free. Clara looked at the dark expanse of the warehouse. She looked at the hypothetical path to freedom. The door was right there. She could walk away. She could leave the monster who had purchased her life, the man who had burned her hopes, to die exactly as he deserved. She owed him nothing. He was a criminal. He was a captor. The world would objectively be a better place without the king of the Boston Syndicate breathing its air. She stood up. She took one step toward the darkness. Julian watched her go, his eyes slipping shut as the adrenaline faded and the agonizing cold of blood loss took over. He had expected this. He believed the world was driven entirely by self-interest and survival. Why would the archivist save the devil? But the sound of retreating footsteps stopped. Julian opened his eyes. Clarisat was kneeling beside him again. She had ripped the hem of her expensive silk blouse, tearing a long, thick strip of fabric. Her face was pale, but her green eyes blazed with a fierce, unwavering determination that eclipsed the terror of the gunfire outside. What are you doing? Julian choked out, genuine bewilderment breaking through his pain. Shut up, Clara ordered. She unbuttoned his ruined jacket, her hands slick with his blood. She found the entry wound just below his collarbone. She balled up the silk fabric and pressed it violently against the bullet hole. Julian roared in agony, his body arching off the cold concrete, his hand flying up to grip her throat in a blind, instinctive reaction to the blinding pain. His fingers tightened against her windpipe, a lethal, conditioned reflex. Clara did not fight him. She did not pry his fingers away. She simply leaned her weight onto the wound, maintaining the life-saving pressure, looking directly into his feral eyes. I am saving your life, Clara said, her voice steady despite the pressure on her throat. Let go of me. Julian stared at her, his vision swimming. The lethal grip on her throat slowly relaxed, his hand falling limply to the floor. He could not comprehend it. He was dying, completely vulnerable, completely at her mercy. And she was fighting to keep him in this world. Why? He rasped, his chest heaving under her hands. I took your life away. I burned your letter. I own you. You should want me dead. Clara pressed harder, the blood soaking through her clothes, staining her hands, her arms, her very soul. She leaned down until her face was inches from his. I am saving you because a life has intrinsic value, Clara whispered fiercely, tears of sheer adrenaline and exhaustion finally spilling over her lashes, mixing with the dirt on her cheeks. Even yours. I am not like you, Julian. I do not decide who lives and who dies based on their utility. Compassion is not a weakness. It is the only thing that separates us from the animals. It is the only thing that makes us human. Julian stared at her, his heart stuttering in his chest. It wasn't just the blood loss. It was the absolute, shattering realization that she meant every single word. She wasn't acting out of fear. She wasn't acting out of a desire for a reward. She was acting out of a pure, unadulterated goodness that he had believed was a myth invented by the weak. The psychological block that had frozen his emotions for 3 years didn't just crack this time. It completely pulverized. The monster didn't just bleed. He felt a profound, terrifying awe for the woman kneeling in his blood. He reached up, his bloody fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw, leaving a crimson smear across her pale skin. You are a terrifying creature, Clara Vance, Julian whispered, right before the darkness finally pulled him under. When Clara woke the next morning, she was in her own massive bed at the Sterling estate. The memories of the night before hit her in fragmented flashes. Marcus breaching the warehouse door, a tactical medical team waiting at a secure, safe house. The endless hours of watching a private surgeon dig a bullet out of Julian's chest. The quiet, unspoken nod of absolute respect Marcus had given her before she finally collapsed from exhaustion. She sat up, her body aching, her hands feeling phantom stains of blood. Resting on the foot of her bed was a sleek, silver laptop. Clara frowned, pulling the device toward her. There was a sticky note attached to the brushed aluminum cover. The handwriting was sharp, elegant, and unmistakably Julian's. The internet connections is uncensored, unmonitored. The gates are still locked, but your mind no longer has to be. Do not make me regret this. Clara stared at the machine, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. An uncensored connection meant contact with the outside world. It meant news. It meant unmonitored communication. It was a terrifying, unprecedented amount of trust from a man who trusted absolutely no one. She opened the laptop, the screen glowing to life, illuminating the darkness of her gilded cage. I wore $2 million in diamonds around my throat, but as the crowd stared, they felt exactly like a noose. The laptop had changed the entire atmosphere of the estate. For 3 weeks following the ambush, a strange, fragile peace settled over the mansion. Julian was confined to his private quarters, recovering from the gunshot wound. He did not summon Clara to the dining room. He did not force her into his presence. Instead, he allowed her the quiet dignity of her work in the library. And in the silence of her room, the laptop became her lifeline. She used it cautiously at first, terrified it was a trap. But as days passed, she realized the connection truly was unmonitored. She anonymously checked on the women from her shelter, discovering they had been temporarily relocated to a state facility. It wasn't perfect, but they were alive. She read the news. She breathed. But the most disorienting change was Julian himself. When he finally emerged from his recovery, pale but commanding, the cold, predator's edge in his eyes had softened into something far more dangerous. He looked at Clara not as a captive asset, but as an equal. The woman who had held his life in her hands and chosen mercy. He engaged her in conversation not to win an argument, but to genuinely listen. It was a terrifying evolution. Clara found herself looking forward to his footsteps in the hall, a realization that filled her with profound guilt and an undeniable, rising heat. Then came the announcement of the Syndicate Gala. It was not a charity event. It was the annual gathering of the Boston elite, the shipping magnates, the politicians, and the shadow figures who actually ran the eastern seaboard. It was an event where power was consolidated and alliances were forged in blood and champagne. And Julian informed Clara that she would attend by his side, not as an archivist, not as a captive, but as his partner. "You saved my life," Julian had told her, standing in her bedroom doorway as tailors fitted her for a gown. "Tonight, the city will understand that you are under my absolute protection. You will stand beside me. You will bow to no one, not even my aunt." Now Clara stood at the top of the grand staircase of the downtown Sterling Hotel. The ballroom below was a sea of opulent wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured, blinding light over women in haute couture and men in bespoke tuxedos. Clara wore a breathtaking gown of midnight blue velvet that clung to her silhouette, pooling around her feet like dark water. But it was the diamonds that drew every eye in the room. A massive, flawless collar of diamonds rested against her collarbone, matching bracelets circling her wrists. They were family heirlooms. Wearing them was a public declaration of her status. Julian stood beside her, looking devastatingly handsome in a classic black tuxedo, the subtle stiffness in his posture the only sign of his recent injury. He offered her his arm. Clara took it, feeling the solid, reassuring heat of his body. Head high. "Clara," he murmured, guiding her down the stairs. "They will stare. Let them. They are looking at the woman who holds my life." As they descended, the whispers began. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Clara felt 100 pairs of eyes assessing her, judging her, calculating her worth. But with Julian's hand covering hers, she felt a strange, intoxicating sense of invincibility. For the first time since she had signed the contract, she felt a terrifying flicker of hope. Maybe she was changing him. Maybe this monster could be redeemed. They reached the floor, and the elite flocked to them. Julian navigated the treacherous waters of high society with lethal grace, introducing Clara to senators, judges, and foreign dignitaries. He did not hide her. He elevated her from across the room. Standing near a towering ice sculpture, Victoria Sterling watched them. Victoria wore an impeccable silver gown, a glass of champagne held loosely in her manicured hand. She did not approach them. She simply watched, her eyes narrowing into cold, reptilian slits. Clara caught her gaze and felt a sudden, icy shiver run down her spine. A primal warning that the fragile piece was a horrifying illusion. 2 hours into the gala, the music was a soft jazz melody. The champagne was flowing. And Clara allowed herself to smile at a joke Julian had whispered in her ear. Then the heavy ballroom doors burst open. 3 men in dark suits pushed past the security detail. They were Julian's top financial lieutenants. Their faces were ashen, slick with terrified sweat. They bypassed the socialites, walking straight up to Julian, completely ignoring protocol. "Boss," the lead accountant gasped, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "We need you in the private boardroom. Now, it's a catastrophe." Julian's smile vanished instantly. The Ice King returned. He turned to Clara. "Stay with Marcus," he commanded softly, before turning and following the men through a side door. Clara stood by the edge of the dance floor, a sudden, sickening dread pooling in her stomach. Marcus stepped closer to her, his hand resting casually near the lapel of his jacket, scanning the crowd. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The whispers in the room changed tone. The jazz music seemed to fade into a sinister background noise. Suddenly, the side door opened. Julian walked out. Clara's breath caught. He looked entirely different. The man who had held her hand, who had looked at her with warmth and respect, was completely gone. His face was a mask of carved granite. His storm gray eyes were dead, flat and terrifyingly cold. He walked directly toward her, his strides long and aggressive. Following closely behind him was Victoria Sterling, clutching a leather dossier to her chest, a look of absolute, triumphant venom on her face. The entire ballroom fell completely silent. The music abruptly stopped. Hundreds of guests turned to watch. Julian stopped 3 feet from Clara. He did not reach for her hand. "Julian," Clara whispered, her voice sounding desperately small in the silent room. "What is wrong?" Victoria stepped around him. She opened the leather dossier and held up a stack of printed financial routing documents. "What is wrong?" "Miss Vance," Victoria announced, her voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom, "is that $20 million was just siphoned from the syndicate's primary holding accounts and wired directly to the offshore accounts of the Hayes faction. The same faction that ambushed my nephew 3 weeks ago. The same faction that nearly killed him." Clara stared at the papers, her mind blanking. "I don't understand." "The financial team just traced the IP address of the unauthorized transfer," Victoria continued, her smile widening into a predatory baring of teeth. "The routing commands did not come from an external hack. They came from inside the Sterling estate. Specifically, from a silver laptop located in the East Wing guest quarters. Your quarters. Your laptop." The words hit Clara like physical blows. The laptop, the uncensored connection, the trust. It wasn't a gift. It was a perfectly laid, inescapable trap. Victoria had used the device to frame her for the ultimate betrayal. Clara looked at Julian. Her heart screamed in her chest. "Julian, you know I didn't do this. You know I don't know how to move syndicate money." "She framed me." Victoria framed me. Julian did not move. He stood perfectly rigid. His eyes darted to the sides of the room, the inner circle of the syndicate. The men who controlled the guns and the territory were closing in. They were watching him. The strict, unbreakable laws of the Mafia were absolute. Treason demanded blood. If Julian defended the woman who had supposedly funded their enemies, he would appear weak. The lieutenants would mutiny. The empire would tear itself apart in a bloody civil war before the night was over. Julian looked back at Clara. For one microscopic fraction of a second, she saw a flash of absolute agony in his eyes. He was cornered. To save his empire, and to keep his lieutenants from drawing their weapons right here on the ballroom floor, he had to play the part of the ruthless king. The mask slammed back into place. "You used my trust," Julian said. His voice was incredibly loud, incredibly cold, echoing off the marble pillars. It was the voice of a judge delivering a death sentence. You used my mercy to fund the men who tried to put me in the ground, Julian. No, Clara cried, stepping toward him, tears instantly blurring her vision. Please, you know me. I saved your life. Julian raised his hand, stopping her advance. He stepped into her personal space. The scent of his cologne, the heat of his body. It all felt like a horrific betrayal. He reached up to her throat. You do not deserve to wear my family's name, he snarled. He grabbed the heavy diamond collar around her neck. He did not unhook the clasp. He pulled. The heavy platinum chain snapped with a violent crack. The $2 million necklace fell to the marble floor, the diamonds scattering like shattered ice. The sound made Clara flinch violently, a sob tearing from her throat. Julian grabbed her wrists, his grip bruising. He ripped the diamond bracelets from her arms, tossing them contemptuously onto the floor alongside the necklace. He stripped her of her status, her dignity, and his protection, right in front of the sneering, laughing elite of Boston. Clara stood trembling, her bare skin feeling violated, her heart shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The man she had started to love had just destroyed her in front of the entire world. Take her out of my sight, Julian ordered, turning his back on her completely. Lock her in the underground cellars at the estate. Let her rot in the dark until I decide how to dispose of her. Marcus stepped forward. The enforcer's face was unreadable, but his hands were surprisingly gentle as he gripped Clara's arms and pulled her away from the crowd. Clara did not fight. She could not walk. She was dragged out of the glittering ballroom, the sound of Victoria's victorious laughter echoing in her ears. Hours later, Clara sat on the freezing stone floor of the estate's underground wine cellar. The darkness was absolute, thick and suffocating. The cold seeped through the thin velvet of her ruined gown, settling deep into her bones. There were no tears left to cry. The betrayal was so profound, so devastating, that it had hollowed out her chest entirely. She had been a fool, stupid, naive, idealistic fool. She had believed that compassion could cure a monster. But the monster had only used her mercy as a weapon to destroy her. She hugged her knees to her chest, waiting for the dawn that she knew she would likely never see. Suddenly, a sound broke the oppressive silence. It was the heavy scrape of iron against stone. The massive oak door of the cellar was unlocking. Clara lifted her head, her breath catching in her throat. A sliver of pale moonlight from the hallway sliced into the pitch-black room. The heavy door slowly creaked open. But it wasn't Julian coming to explain. It wasn't Marcus coming to bring her food. A tall figure stepped into the sliver of light. He wore entirely black tactical gear. His face was obscured by a dark mask, and wrapped tightly between his leather-clad hands, catching the faint glint of the moonlight, was a thin, lethal strand of garrote wire. Running blind into the night is always better than dying quietly in the dark. The silver light of the moon bled through the narrow grating near the ceiling of the wine cellar, casting a pale, skeletal glow over the stone walls. It was barely enough to see, but it was enough to catch the lethal, metallic shimmer of the garrote wire as it was pulled taut between the leather-gloved hands of the assassin. He stepped fully into the cellar, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him, sealing them in the tomb. He did not speak. He did not rush. He moved with the terrifying, unhurried grace of a professional who knew his victim had absolutely nowhere to run. Clara scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the freezing, damp flagstones. Her breath tore through her lungs in ragged, terrified gasps. Her mind raced, desperately trying to process the nightmare. Julian had condemned her, yes. He had stripped her of the diamonds and thrown her into the dark. But Julian's violence was always theatrical, always public. He wanted to break her spirit, not her neck in the shadows. This was not Julian's executioner. This was Victoria's. The matriarch of the Sterling family was tying up the final loose end, ensuring that the archivist would never live to about the rigged financial transfer. Stay away from me, Clara gasped, her voice echoing hollowly against the vaulted ceiling. The assassin tilted his head, a grotesque pantomime of sympathy, and took another measured step forward. Survival, Clara realized in that fraction of a second, was not a matter of morality. It was a matter of sheer, unadulterated animal instinct. She was an archivist. She spent her life preserving fragile things. But as the man lunged forward, the garrote wire slicing through the stale air toward her throat, the fragile thing she had to preserve was her own beating heart. She threw herself violently to the right, crashing into a towering wooden rack of vintage wines. The assassin's wire hissed past her ear, snagging on the collar of her ruined velvet gown and tearing the fabric. Clara did not pause to scream. She grabbed the nearest bottle, a heavy, dust-caked magnum of Bordeaux, and swung it with every ounce of strength she possessed. The thick glass shattered against the side of the assassin's masked head. The explosion of red wine and green glass momentarily blinded him, forcing a grunt of pain from his throat. He staggered backward, his grip on the wire loosening for a single, precious heartbeat. Clara did not hesitate. She dropped the jagged neck of the bottle and bolted for the door. But the assassin was impossibly fast. His heavy combat boot lashed out, sweeping Clara's legs from beneath her. She hit the stone floor hard, all the air rushing from her lungs in a sickening rush. Before she could recover, a heavy knee dropped onto her spine, pinning her to the ground. The cold steel wire slipped smoothly over her head, biting instantly into the soft flesh of her throat. Panic, absolute and blinding, exploded in her brain. She clawed frantically at her neck, her manicured nails tearing at the wire and the leather gloves holding it, but the assassin's grip was iron. The pressure was immense. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. The blood roared in her ears, drowning out the sound of her own suffocating gasps. She was going to die here, in the dark, framed for a crime she didn't commit, erased by the very monsters she had tried to cure. Her thrashing hand struck something on the floor, a jagged, massive shard of the broken wine bottle. With the last fading ounce of oxygen in her blood, Clara gripped the thick glass shard. She did not aim wildly. She remembered Julian's anatomy books in the library. She drove the jagged glass backward, burying it deep into the assassin's femoral artery, right above the knee. The man let out a blood-curdling shriek. The garrote wire instantly went slack as his hands flew to his leg, desperately trying to stem the sudden, catastrophic fountain of arterial blood. Clara rolled away, coughing violently, dragging oxygen back into her burning lungs. She scrambled to her feet, her legs trembling so violently she could barely stand. The assassin was writhing on the floor, the dark wine mixing with the bright, hot crimson of his own blood. She did not look back. Clara threw her weight against the heavy iron latch of the cellar door. It had not been locked from the outside. The assassin had intended to walk back out. The door groaned open, and Clara spilled out into the dimly lit corridor of the sub-basement. The estate above was silent, the gala still raging miles away at the downtown hotel. Clara knew the layout of the grounds from her careful observations from her bedroom window. She avoided the main staircases, navigating the labyrinthine servant corridors that smelled of bleach and cold stone. She found the delivery loading dock at the rear of the kitchens. The heavy rolling door was cracked open just enough for ventilation. Clara slipped through the gap and plunged into the freezing, torrential rain. The shock of the cold water against her bare skin was agonizing, but it cleared the remaining fog of oxygen deprivation from her brain. She ran. She hitched the heavy, soaked velvet of her gown up to her thighs and sprinted across the manicured lawns. She avoided the sweeping beams of the perimeter security lights, moving like a ghost through the ancient, towering oak trees. When she reached the 10-foot wrought iron boundary wall, she did not hesitate. The adrenaline is masking the pain in her torn, bleeding hands. She climbed the ornate ironwork, throwing herself over the top and dropping into the muddy ditch on the other side. She hit the ground hard, twisting her ankle, but the pain was a distant, secondary concern. She was out. She was free from the fortress. Clara ran for miles. The midnight streets of the Boston outskirts were deserted. slick with rain and bathed in the sickly orange glow of sodium street lamps. She lost her designer heels in the first mile, her bare feet cutting against gravel and broken asphalt. Her midnight blue gown, once a symbol of $2 million worth of protection, was now a heavy, mud-caked rag clinging to her freezing body. Cars passed occasionally, their headlights washing over her. But she hid in the shadows of bus stops and alleyways. She could trust no one. Julian had said it himself. He owned the police. He owned the streets. If a patrol car found her, they would deliver her right back to his doorstep. Her mind frantically searched for a sanctuary. The women's shelter was rubble. Her old apartment had been cleared out. She had no money, no phone, no identification. Then a memory surfaced through the panic. A remote safe house. Years ago, before she ran her own shelter, she had volunteered for the Hope Women's Advocacy Group, a massive, well-funded charity. They maintained a secure, off-the-books cabin on the edge of the state forest, used for hiding high-risk domestic abuse victims from powerful abusers. Clara had been one of the few coordinators entrusted with the location and the physical kunko. If the organization was still operating it, it would be empty, stocked with emergency supplies, and completely off the grid. It took her 3 grueling hours to reach the edge of the woods. The rain had slowed to a miserable, freezing drizzle. Clara dragged herself up the muddy embankment, her body shivering violently, on the verge of hypothermia. Through the dense pine trees, she saw the dark silhouette of the cabin. No lights, no cars. It was completely isolated. She stumbled onto the wooden porch, her bloody fingers leaving smears on the digital keypad by the heavy oak door. She prayed the code hadn't been changed in the 3 years since she had left the organization. 4729. A small green light blinked. The heavy deadbolt clicked open. Clara pushed the door open and collapsed into the dry, dusty hallway. She kicked the door shut behind her and threw the manual deadbolts, locking herself inside the darkness. She slumped against the solid wood, her chest heaving, tears of sheer, overwhelming relief finally spilling hot down her freezing cheeks. She had done it. She had survived the assassin. She had escaped the Ice King. She had navigated the treacherous dark and found sanctuary. She crawled into the main living room, feeling her way through the dark until her hands found a heavy wool blanket draped over the back of a sofa. She wrapped it around her trembling shoulders, the rough fabric feeling like a lifeline. She sat on the floor, pulling her knees to her chest, listening to the wind howling through the pine trees outside. She was safe. She would rest until dawn, find the emergency cash stash hidden in the floorboards, and buy a bus ticket to a city where the Sterling name meant absolutely nothing. She would rebuild. She would survive, for the first time in hours. Clara let her eyes drift shut. She breathed. Click. The sound was metallic, sharp. It was the sound of a key sliding into the front door lock. Clara's eyes snapped open. Her blood turned ice in her veins. She held her breath, shrinking back into the shadows of the sofa. The heavy manual deadbolts she had thrown began to turn, one by one, manipulated by a master key from the outside. The front door swung open. The beam of a high-powered tactical flashlight swept through the hallway, followed by the heavy, synchronized footsteps of multiple men. The light cut through the darkness of the living room, panning over the dust motes, the fireplace, and finally pinning Clara against the wall like a trapped animal in the headlights of an oncoming truck. Someone flicked a switch. The cabin was instantly flooded with harsh, blinding overhead light. Clara threw a hand up to shield her eyes. When her vision cleared, the illusion of safety shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Standing in the center of the living room, flanked by 4 armed mercenaries in tactical gear, was District Attorney Robert Hayes. He wore a pristine, camel hair overcoat, perfectly dry, not a single silver hair out of place. He looked at Clara, huddled in her ruined velvet gown and the dusty wool blanket, shivering on the floor. A slow, chillingly aristocratic smile spread across his handsome face. He unbuttoned his coat with elegant, practiced movements. "You know, Miss Vance." Hayes said, his voice echoing in the small cabin, smooth and dripping with poisonous satisfaction. When my men at the perimeter reported a woman matching your description, crawling through the mud toward this property, I simply could not believe my luck. It felt almost too poetic. Clara stared at him, her mind completely unable to process the nightmare. How? How are you here? This is a charity safe house. The Hope Advocacy Group. Hayes chuckled, a rich, dark sound. He walked to a small wet bar in the corner of the room and began pouring himself a glass of whiskey from an emergency decanter. The Hope Advocacy Group, Hayes repeated, turning back to face her, the amber liquid swirling in his glass. A beautiful organization, so noble, so inspiring to the voters. It brings a tear to the eye during my campaign speeches. Do you have any idea how much money wealthy? Guilty housewives donate to a charity that promises to protect battered women. Millions, Clara, tens of millions of dollars. He took a slow sip of the whiskey. His eyes locked onto her horrified face. It is the perfect political front, Hayes explained softly. My campaign owns the holding company that owns the charity. The donations come in. The money is scrubbed clean through the operational expenses of safe houses like this one, and it flows directly into my offshore campaign accounts. The Sterling Syndicate has been paying me through this very charity for 5 years. This house doesn't belong to battered women. Clara, it belongs to me. The devastating reality crashed down on Clara with the weight of an anvil. There was no safe place. There was no escape from the system. The very organization she had dedicated her life to, the charity she had believed was a beacon of light in a dark world, was nothing more than a money-laundering machine for the corrupt men who destroyed the women they claimed to protect. She hadn't run to a sanctuary. She had run directly into the heart of the spider's web. Hayes stepped closer, looking down at her battered, bleeding feet and the dirt smeared across her pale face. He reached out and aggressively grabbed her chin, tilting her head up to face him. His eyes roamed over her throat, landing on the angry, red, bruised line where the garrote wire had cut into her flesh. You have been a very busy girl tonight, Hayes murmured, his thumb brushing cruelly over the fresh bruise, making Clara wince. He smiled, dropping his hand and stepping back to address his armed men. Secure her to the chair in the center of the room, the district attorney commanded, adjusting his silk tie, and set up the camera. It's time we negotiated a new treaty with the King of Boston. Let's see just how much Julian's favorite pet is truly worth. Being sold once is a tragedy. Being sold twice destroys the soul entirely. The ropes binding Clara to the heavy wooden dining chair dug viciously into her wrists, chafing against the raw, bruised skin left behind by Julian's aggressive removal of her diamond bracelets. She sat perfectly still in the center of the cabin's brightly lit living room, her ruined midnight blue velvet gown clinging to her shivering body like a funeral shroud. Across the room, District Attorney Robert Hayes sat comfortably on a leather sofa, his legs crossed, sipping his whiskey. A heavy, industrial-grade tripod had been erected 5 feet in front of Clara, supporting a high-definition camera with a blinking red recording light. You see, Clara, Hayes said conversationally, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Julian Sterling is a mathematical anomaly. He is a man who operates an empire built on ruthless calculation, yet he committed a fatal, emotional error. He let you live. Clara kept her eyes locked on the floorboards, refusing to give Hayes the satisfaction of her terror. When Victoria framed you for funding my little ambush, Hayes continued, standing up and pacing slowly around her. She expected Julian to execute you on the ballroom floor. It is the law of the syndicate. Blood for betrayal. But Julian didn't kill you. He stripped you of your jewels to appease his lieutenants, and he sent you to a cellar. Why? Because the Ice King is melting. Because you found a way to crawl inside his chest and restart that dead, black heart of his. Hayes stopped behind her chair, leaning down so his mouth was close to her ear. She could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. And a man with a beating heart is a man with a weakness, Hayes whispered. I am currently facing a massive federal indictment. The Department of Justice is breathing down my neck. I need a sacrificial lamb to feed them. I need the Sterling Syndicate's shipping territory, the ports, the manifests. I need it all to buy my immunity. Julian would never cede his territory for money. He would never cede it for threats. But for you. Hayes walked back around to the front of the camera. He pulled a sleek satellite phone from his overcoat pocket and dialed a number. He placed it on the coffee table on speakerphone. The line rang twice. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Speak, the single, guttural syllable cut through the speaker like a physical blade. Julian's voice. It was devoid of any warmth, any hesitation. It was the voice of the predator. Good evening, Julian, Hayes said, leaning back on the sofa. I hope the gala was a success. I hear there was a bit of a domestic disturbance on the dance floor. Hayes, Julian rasped. If you are calling to gloat about the funds you stole, make it quick. I have a team currently triangulating the signal of this phone. You have about 4 minutes before I turn whatever building you are standing in into a crater. I wouldn't be so hasty. Hayes chuckled smoothly. I have something of yours, or rather, something you carelessly misplaced in the rain. Hayes reached forward and turned the screen of his phone toward the camera, initiating a secure video feed. Clara knew Julian was now looking at the exact image the camera was capturing. Clara, beaten, bruised, tied to a chair in a dingy cabin, wearing the ruined remains of the velvet gown he had given her. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. The audio did not pick up a gasp, a curse, or even a sharp intake of breath. When Julian spoke again, his voice was chillingly flat. She is a traitor to my organization. You can keep her. The words struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. The last microscopic ember of hope in her chest was violently extinguished. She had known Julian was ruthless. She knew he had disowned her publicly, but some desperate, pathetic part of her soul had clung to the belief that he had done it to protect her, that throwing her in the cellar was a ruse to save her from the lieutenants. But hearing his flat, indifferent dismissal to the man who was holding her hostage shattered that delusion. She was nothing to him. She was an asset that had lost its value. Hayes laughed, clearly unimpressed by the bluff. Save the theatrical indifference for your capos. Julian, Victoria already told me everything. You didn't kill her because you couldn't bring yourself to do it. You're obsessed with the little archivist. So, here are my terms. You will digitally transfer the deeds to the North Harbor shipping terminals, along with full, unrestricted access to the syndicate's import manifests. To the holding company I'm sending into your encrypted server. You will do this in the next 20 minutes. If you do, I leave the girl here, alive if you refuse. I will start mailing her back to the estate, piece by piece. 20 minutes, Julian said, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. The line went dead. Clara slumped in the chair, her head hanging heavily. The tears she had held back finally spilled, hot and bitter, tracking through the dirt on her face. She was going to die here. Julian would never surrender half his empire for a woman he believed had betrayed him. But 19 minutes later, the heavy front door of the cabin exploded inward. The reinforced oak shattered into massive splinters as the door was kicked off its hinges. The 4 mercenaries raised their assault rifles, shouting tactical commands, swinging the muzzles toward the dark threshold. Julian Sterling walked through the doorway. He was completely unarmed. His hands hung loosely at his sides. He wore a heavy, dark wool overcoat over his tuxedo, standing silhouetted against the dark pine forest behind him. The rain beat down on his shoulders. His face was a mask of absolute, terrifying calm. He didn't flinch as 4 laser sights painted red dots across his chest. Julian, Hayes said, standing up, his eyes widening in genuine shock. He had expected a digital transfer, perhaps a negotiator. He had not expected the King of Boston to walk into a fortified trap without a weapon. I must say, I am surprised. I assumed you would send Marcus to handle the paperwork. Julian did not look at Hayes. He did not look at the guns. He looked directly at Clara. His storm gray eyes swept over her bruised throat, her bleeding, bare feet, the ropes binding her wrists. The muscle in his jaw twitched violently. a microscopic crack in his impenetrable armor. Clara stared back at him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Why was he here? Why would he risk his life, his empire, to walk into this room? Julian slowly turned his attention to Hayes. You demanded my territory, Julian said, his voice echoing in the ruined doorway. I do not negotiate over the phone. I brought the transfer codes. He reached slowly into the inside pocket of his overcoat. The mercenaries tightened their grips on their triggers. Hayes raised a hand, signaling them to hold. Julian pulled out a sleek, encrypted flash drive. He held it up in the harsh overhead light. Half the shipping territory, the manifests, everything you need to feed the federal prosecutors and save your own pathetic political career. It is all here. Hayes smiled, a greedy, triumphant light entering his eyes. He stepped forward, holding out his hand. Toss it on the table, and step back. Julian did not toss the drive. He kept it firmly in his grasp. He looked at Clara again, his eyes dark, unreadable pools. Then he looked at the grand expanse of his empire represented on the small digital drive in his hand. He weighed them. The power, the wealth, the absolute control of the city, versus the archivist, the woman who had argued with him, who had refused his food to save a maid, who had pressed her hands against his bleeding chest and told him his life had value. The tension in the room was suffocating. Clara held her breath, watching the man she loved calculate her worth against his kingdom. Julian turned his gaze back to Hayes. The terrifying, flat indifference returned to his face, wiping away any trace of humanity. You miscalculated, Robert, Julian said, his voice cold enough to freeze the air in the cabin. He looked at Clara with absolute disdain. Keep her. She was only ever a temporary asset. The territory stays with me. Julian put the flash drive back into his pocket. The words hit Clara with the force of a bullet. The physical pain of the ropes was nothing compared to the agonizing, tearing sensation in her chest. It was the ultimate, soul-crushing despair. He hadn't come to save her. He had come to look his enemy in the eye and tell him that Clara Vance meant absolutely nothing. He had walked into the trap merely to prove that he was completely unaffected by the bait. He was throwing her to the wolves. Hayes burst into cruel, triumphant laughter. Well, I must admit, Julian, you are colder than I gave you credit for. Victoria will be thrilled. You can walk back out that door, King, but I promise you, the video I broadcast of what we do to your temporary asset tonight will ruin whatever reputation you have left. Julian turned around. He prepared to walk back out into the rain. But as he turned, his profile was illuminated by the harsh overhead light. Clara, drowning in her despair, watched him go. And in that final, devastating second, Julian did something impossible. He flexed his jaw. It wasn't the violent twitch of anger. It was a slow, deliberate, rhythmic flex. Once, twice. Clara's heart stopped. Her mind flashed back to their first week in the library. They had been debating power dynamics, discussing the tells of a liar. Julian had stood by the fireplace, swirling a glass of bourbon. When a predator is cornered, Clara, he had told her, he does not roar. He feigns weakness. He acts indifferent. And when he bluffs, the body always betrays the lie. A true sociopath can control his eyes, his breathing, his pulse. But he cannot control the masseter muscle. When I bluff, my jaw flexes twice. It is the only warning the victim ever gets before the strike. Julian had deliberately shown her his tell. He had planted the seed weeks ago, in the quiet sanctuary of the archive. He wasn't abandoning her. He was bluffing Hayes. Clara swallowed the massive, overwhelming wave of hope threatening to explode in her chest. If Hayes saw her realize the truth, Julian would be gunned down instantly. She had to play her part. She had to be the broken, discarded asset. As Julian took his first step toward the door, Clara threw her head back and unleashed a scream of pure, agonizing devastation. Julian, she shrieked, thrashing violently against the ropes, her voice cracking with a perfectly executed, hysterical desperation. You can't leave me. Please, you promised me. You owe me my life. She began to sob loudly, her body shaking, hyperventilating as she begged the retreating figure. "Don't leave me with him. I'll do anything. Please, Julian." Hayes smiled, completely captivated by the pathetic, broken display. He turned his attention away from Julian, waving a dismissive hand toward the door. "Let him go." Hayes ordered his men, his eyes fixed on Clara's theatrical breakdown. "Let the king walk away like a coward. He's finished in this town." Julian walked out into the rain. The broken doorframe remained empty. The darkness of the forest swallowed him whole. Hayes walked slowly toward Clara, pulling a heavy, serrated hunting knife from a sheath on his belt. The blade glinted under the lights. He chuckled, the sound wet and sickening. "Well, my dear," Hayes whispered, dragging the flat side of the cold blade against Clara's tear-stained cheek. "It seems your knight in shining armor just traded you for a shipping port. Such a tragic ending to a beautiful romance. But don't worry. I will make sure the camera captures your best angles." Clara continued to weep, her eyes wide with feigned terror, watching the blade, but beneath the sound of her own sobs, beneath the cruel laughter of the district attorney, Clara's ears strained toward the open doorway. She listened to the sounds of the night, the rain hitting the mud, the wind through the pines, and the distinct, low rumbling idle of an armored SUV engine that had not shifted into drive. Julian had not left the driveway. The devil was still in the dark, and he was about to bring hell to the cabin. Hell did not rise from the ground. It came to Boston dressed in tailored suits and carrying federal warrants. Inside the cabin, the heavy, oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of District Attorney Robert Hayes, adjusting the lens of the high-definition camera. The red recording light blinked steadily, a digital eye preparing to broadcast an execution to the darkest corners of the internet. Clara remained bound to the heavy wooden chair. She kept her chin lowered, her shoulders shaking in a perfectly executed display of absolute despair. She wept, she begged. She played the part of the discarded, broken asset to absolute perfection. But beneath the chaotic tangle of her honey-blonde hair, her green eyes were wide, alert, and tracking every single movement in the room. She listened. The wind howled against the timber walls. The rain lashed against the dirty window panes. And beneath it all, she could still feel the low, seismic vibration of the armored SUV idling at the edge of the tree line. Julian was out there. The Ice King was waiting in the dark. Hayes turned away from the camera. He wiped the flat side of his serrated hunting knife against the sleeve of his camel hair overcoat. He smiled, a cold, empty expression that did not reach his eyes. Julian Sterling built his empire on the myth of his own invulnerability, Hayes said to the camera, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a politician addressing a podium. He believed he was untouchable. He believed he could operate above the law, above consequence, and above the very people who allowed him to exist. Tonight, we dismantle that myth. We show the world exactly what happens when the King of Boston abandons his most prized possession to save his own skin. Hayes stepped toward Clara. He raised the knife, the cold steel pressed against her collarbone, right where Julian's diamond necklace had rested just hours before. The blade bit into her skin. A single hot drop of blood welled to the surface and tracked slowly down her chest. Clara gasped, a genuine sound of pain piercing through her feigned hysteria. "Look at the camera, my dear," Hayes whispered, leaning in close. "Let them see the exact moment your heart breaks." Outside, the low, rumbling vibration of the idling engine suddenly cut out. The night fell completely, terrifyingly silent. Clara held her breath. The silence was heavier than the storm. It was the silence before a strike. Then the night exploded. It did not begin with a gunshot. It began with a deafening, mechanical shriek that tore through the forest. Sirens, dozens of them. The piercing wail of federal law enforcement vehicles converging on the cabin from every direction. The pitch-black windows of the safe house were instantly flooded with violent, strobing flashes of red and blue light. The chaotic beams slashed through the dusty air of the living room, casting wild, shifting shadows across the walls. Hayes froze, the knife hovering against Clara's throat, his aristocratic face drained of all color. He looked toward the windows, his eyes wide with sudden, unadulterated panic. No, no, this isn't right. The drop wasn't scheduled. They shouldn't be here. The first catastrophe hit with the force of a freight train. The glass of the front window shattered inward. A heavy, cylindrical canister tumbled across the floorboards, rolling to a stop directly beneath the heavy tripod of the camera. Flashbang. One of the mercenaries screamed, diving behind the leather sofa. A blinding, magnesium white light erupted in the center of the room. The sheer concussive force of the blast hit Clara in the chest, stealing the oxygen from her lungs. A high-pitched, agonizing whine pierced her eardrums, instantly drowning out the sirens and the shouts of the armed men. The world dissolved into a disorienting, white-hot blur. The front door of the cabin was blown completely off its hinges by a breaching charge. The heavy wood splintered into 1,000 jagged pieces, flying across the room like shrapnel. Dozens of FBI tactical agents poured through the threshold. They were clad in heavy black tactical armor, their assault rifles raised, sweeping the room with laser sights. Federal agents. Drop your weapons. A voice boomed over a megaphone. Absolute chaos erupted. Hayes's mercenaries, realizing they were cornered and facing federal prison, did not surrender. They opened fire. The deafening staccato of automatic weapons filled the small cabin. Bullets tore through the drywall, shredding the leather furniture and shattering the remaining windows. The smell of ozone, pulverized drywall, and burning cordate thickened the air, choking Clara as she thrashed against her ropes. She was trapped in the crossfire, completely exposed in the center of the room. Hayes dropped the hunting knife. He abandoned the camera. He scrambled backward, crawling on his hands and knees toward the rear hallway of the cabin, desperately trying to escape the federal raid. Then, the rear door of the cabin was kicked open. Julian Sterling did not enter the room like a man. He entered like a localized natural disaster. He moved through the chaotic, strobing lights with a terrifying, predatory grace. He wore no body armor. He carried a suppressed tactical pistol in his right hand. The muzzle flashed twice in rapid succession, casting sharp, chiaroscuro shadows across his rigidly focused face. Two of Hayes' mercenaries dropped to the floor, eliminated before they could even pivot their rifles. Julian was a ghost in the crossfire. He did not flinch as federal bullets tore through the walls around him. His storm gray eyes were locked onto one target. He reached the center of the room. He stepped over the shattered camera equipment. He raised his weapon, aiming directly at the retreating figure of District Attorney Robert Hayes. Hayes scrambled to his feet, pulling a small revolver from his ankle holster. He turned, his eyes wide with absolute terror as he leveled the weapon at Julian's chest. She was bait. Hayes screamed over the gunfire. Victoria tipped them off. Your aunt sold us both out to clear the board. Julian did not flex his jaw. He did not hesitate. He squeezed the trigger. A single suppressed shot cut through the chaos. Hayes' head snapped back violently. The district attorney collapsed backward, hitting the floorboards with a heavy, lifeless thud. The corrupt political machine of Boston was dead. Julian dropped his empty pistol. He ignored the tactical agents swarming the front of the cabin. He ignored the federal lasers painting red dots across his tailored overcoat. He rushed to Clara, dropping to his knees on the glass-covered floor. He pulled a folding tactical knife from his pocket and sliced through the thick ropes binding her wrists. Clara gasped, falling forward into his chest. His arms wrapped around her, crushing her against him. He was solid. He was real. He was burning hot against the freezing dampness of her ruined gown. I have you. Julian rasped against her hair, his breath ragged. You're safe. I have you. You came back. Clara sobbed, burying her face in his neck, her bloody fingers gripping the lapels of his coat. You bluffed him. I would burn the world to ash before I let anyone take you from me. Julian swore, his hand cupping the back of her head, shielding her from the flying debris. How incredibly touching. The voice cut through the ringing in Clara's ears. It was smooth, cultured, dripping with aristocratic venom. Julian froze. He slowly turned his head, Stepping out from the shadows of the rear hallway, completely untouched by the chaos of the raid, was Victoria Sterling. She wore a pristine, slate gray trench coat. Her silver hair was perfectly styled. In her gloved right hand, she held a heavy, silver revolver. She had bypassed the federal perimeter entirely. "Victoria," Julian said, his voice deadly calm. The FBI raid was quite the spectacle. Victoria mused, stepping carefully over Hayes' body. "I must admit, Robert was a useful idiot for many years. But the federal indictments were drawing too close to the family name. The board needed to be cleared. Robert had to die. And you, my dear nephew, had become dangerously unstable. A king who makes decisions based on the heartbeat of a temporary asset is a king who will ruin the empire." Victoria raised the silver revolver. She aimed it directly at Clara's chest. "The Sterling Syndicate requires ruthless leadership," Victoria said, her eyes utterly devoid of warmth. "I will take over the legitimate fronts. I will mourn you publicly. And the little archivist will be just another tragic casualty of a federal shootout." Victoria pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening in the confined space. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the impact, but it never came. Julian moved with blinding, desperate speed. He twisted his body violently, throwing his entire weight over Clara, shielding her completely. The heavy caliber bullet struck Julian point blank in the center of his chest. He let out a sharp, breathless grunt. The force of the impact threw him backward. He collapsed onto the floorboards, his hand slipping from Clara's grip. A massive, terrifying bloom of dark crimson immediately soaked through his white dress shirt. "Julian," Clara screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony tearing from her throat. Victoria took a step back, her face a mask of cold satisfaction. She raised the gun again, preparing to finish the job, but before she could cock the hammer, the front windows of the cabin completely shattered inward. A dozen heavily armed FBI agents swarmed the room, tackling Victoria to the floor and kicking the silver revolver from her hand. The cabin was flooded with federal agents. Boots stomped across the broken glass. Flashlights blinded Clara as she scrambled over the debris, throwing herself onto Julian's bleeding body. Her hands pressed desperately against his chest, her fingers slick with his blood. His storm gray eyes were open, staring up at the ceiling, glassy and unfocused. "Stay with me," Clara sobbed, her tears falling onto his pale face. "Julian, please. Look at me. You promised." His lips parted. He tried to draw a breath, but a wet, rattling sound echoed in his chest. His hand twitched, his bloody fingers weakly brushing against her cheek. "Get her out of here," an agent shouted. Strong hands grabbed Clara from behind. She fought them wildly, kicking and thrashing, screaming Julian's name until her throat bled. But she was exhausted, battered, and utterly powerless against the tactical armor of the agents. They dragged her away from his body, hauling her out the shattered front door into the freezing rain. The strobing red and blue lights blinded her. Handcuffs were aggressively clamped around her bruised wrists. She was shoved into the back of a federal transport vehicle as the heavy metal doors slammed shut, sealing her in the dark. The last thing she saw was a team of paramedics rushing into the cabin, converging on the massive pool of blood spreading across the floorboards. The king was down, and the empire had finally fallen. Empires fall, kings die, but the truth will always survive the ashes. 6 months had passed since the night the Boston rain turned to blood. The autumn wind whipped through the downtown streets, scattering golden leaves across the immaculate pavement. Clara Vance stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office. The view from the 30th floor was breathtaking. She wore a tailored, emerald green suit. Her honey blonde hair was pulled back into a sharp, professional clasp. She was no longer a captive archivist. She was no longer a pawn. The brass plaque on the heavy oak door behind her read, "The Vance Foundation for Women's Advocacy." It was the largest, most heavily funded nonprofit organization on the Eastern Seaboard, and it had been built entirely on the ruins of the Sterling Syndicate. During her interrogation in the federal holding facility 6 months ago, Clara had not asked for a lawyer. She had asked for the director of the FBI. She had sat in the cold, steel room and recited, from perfect photographic memory, every single name, offshore routing number, and payout date she had seen in Victoria's black ledger. She had mapped the entire criminal infrastructure of the city from the confines of her holding cell, in exchange for her absolute, unrestricted immunity. The federal government had used her testimony to execute the largest organized crime sweep in the history of the state. Victoria Sterling had been arrested at her country club while sipping a mimosa. She was currently serving consecutive life sentences in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Her aristocratic pride rotting in a concrete cell, the corrupt politicians, the bought judges, and the dirty police commissioners had all been purged. The syndicate's illicit assets were seized, and in an unprecedented legal move, the Department of Justice had awarded a massive portion of the seized legitimate real estate and liquid assets to Clara's foundation, as restitution for the destruction of her original shelter and the illegal human trafficking she had endured. She had won. She had leveled the mountain. She had secured the safety of thousands of women across the state. But as Clara looked out over the glittering Boston skyline, her chest felt completely hollow. The official federal report stated that Julian Sterling had succumbed to his gunshot wounds on the floor of the cabin. His body had been quietly cremated by the state. The media had run sensational headlines for weeks about the violent end of the Ice King. Clara had not attended a funeral. There had been no grave to visit. She carried the heavy, crushing weight of his absence every single day. He had taken a bullet meant for her heart. He had died proving that her life meant more to him than his empire. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Her assistant, a bright young woman named Sarah, poked her head through the doorway. Director Vance, Sarah said respectfully. The press conference is ready for you in the lobby. The national networks are all set up. Clara took a deep breath. She smoothed the lapels of her suit. Thank you, Sarah, I'm on my way. Clara descended to the lobby. The grand atrium of the foundation was filled with reporters, flashing cameras, and state officials. She walked to the podium with practiced grace. She spoke for 20 minutes about the foundation's new housing initiatives, the expansion of their legal defense funds for domestic abuse survivors, and the absolute, unwavering necessity of holding powerful systems accountable. She was eloquent. She was fierce. She was the face of justice in the city. When the conference ended, Clara slipped out the side entrance to avoid the remaining press. The evening air was crisp and biting. The streetlights flickered to life, casting long, dramatic shadows across the brick pavement. Clara pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, exhausted from the performance. She walked down the quiet, tree-lined avenue toward her waiting car. She paused. A figure was leaning against the brick wall of an alleyway, half hidden in the shadows. He wore a simple, charcoal wool coat, no tailored suits, no diamond cufflinks, no armored SUV idling at the curb, no bodyguards lurking in the darkness. Just a man, standing quietly in the evening chill. Clara's heart stopped dead in her chest. Her briefcase slipped from her fingers, hitting the pavement with a sharp crack. The man stepped out of the shadows and under the amber glow of the streetlight. Julian, he was alive. He looked older. There were faint, silver lines of exhaustion around his eyes. A slight stiffness in his posture hinted at the massive trauma his chest had endured. But the terrifying, predatory coldness that had always frozen his storm-gray eyes was entirely gone. He looked at her not with the possessive hunger of a mafia king, but with the quiet, profound awe of a man looking at a miracle. Clara could not breathe. She took a trembling step forward, terrified that if she blinked, the hallucination would vanish into the autumn wind. The news, Clara choked out, her voice barely a whisper. They said you died on the floor of that cabin. The FBI released the report. Julian took a slow step toward her. He kept his hands visible, loose at his sides. He did not invade her space. He waited for her to bridge the gap. The FBI needed Victoria to believe she had won, Julian said. his voice a rough, familiar rasp that sent a violent shiver down Clara's spine. They needed her to step into the power vacuum so they could catch her authorizing the offshore transfers you told them about. I survived the surgery in a secure federal bunker, but I knew that as long as I was the head of the syndicate, you would never truly be safe. The target on my back would eventually be painted on yours. Clara stared at him, tears welling in her eyes, blurring the glow of the streetlights. What did you do? Julian. Julian looked up at the towering glass facade of the Vance Foundation building. I traded it. Julian said simply. I sat down with the director of the FBI. I gave them the encryption keys to every shadow account my family owned. I gave them the international shipping manifests. I gave them everything the syndicate had built for 3 generations. In exchange, they gave me immunity. They sealed my file. They wiped my name from the federal databases. And they let the world believe Julian Sterling was Ash. Clara's mind raced. You gave up your empire, your wealth, your power. You have nothing left. Julian looked back at her. The corners of his mouth lifted into a soft, genuine smile. It was the first time she had ever seen him smile without a trace of irony or cruelty. It fundamentally changed his entire face. I have my life, Julian said softly, and I am finally free of the cage I built for myself. He took a small step closer. I watched your press conference on a television in a diner across the street. You built an empire of your own. Miss Vance, an empire built on light instead of blood. You don't need a king to protect you anymore. Clara looked at the man standing before her. He was stripped of his toxic dominance. He had voluntarily surrendered every ounce of his leverage, his wealth, and his institutional power just to exist in the same world as her, without casting a shadow over her life. He was approaching her not as an asset to be purchased, but as an absolute equal, true equality, true respect, the only foundation upon which a real love could survive. Clara stepped forward, closing the distance between them. She reached out with trembling fingers. She pressed her hand flat against the center of his chest, right over the thick scar hidden beneath his wool coat. She felt the strong, steady, furious beating of his heart beneath her palm. It was real. He was real. I hear you are out of work, Mr. Sterling, Clara whispered, looking up into his storm-gray eyes. Julian's hand came up, gently covering hers, pressing her palm closer to his heart. I am, Julian murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. And I have a lot to learn about taking orders. Clara smiled, a radiant, blinding expression of pure joy. She grabbed the lapels of his wool coat and pulled him down. When their lips met, there was no desperation. There was no fear. There was no cage. It was the taste of absolute freedom, forged in the fire of their survival, and sealed in the quiet, undeniable truth that some monsters could be saved by the light. If you loved Clara's journey of resilience and this high-stakes romance, hit subscribe. What would you do if the Mafia King offered you a dangerous contract? Let me know in the comments below. See you in the next story. And so the Ice King's empire falls, not by the bullet of a rival cartel or the gavel of a corrupt judge, but by the quiet, unyielding strength of a woman who simply refused to be owned. As the dust settles on the Boston underworld and the flashing red and blue lights fade into the autumn wind, we are left with a resolution that completely redefines the landscape of power. What we just witnessed between Julian Sterling and Clara Vance is far more than a high-stakes romance or a tale of survival. It is a profound exploration of human dignity, the illusion of control, and the radical courage required to love as equals. In the beginning, Julian operated under the assumption that the world ran entirely on self-interest, steel, and blood. He believed that dominance, wealth, and fear were the only currencies that mattered. He viewed Clara as an asset, a pawn to be controlled and protected only so long as she served a purpose. But Clara taught him, and all of us, the most dangerous and beautiful lesson of all. Compassion is never a weakness. It is the ultimate, undeniable strength. When Clara pressed her hands to Julian's bleeding chest in that warehouse, refusing to let the monster die in the dark, She shattered the myth of his invulnerability. She proved that human morality cannot be bought, sold, or broken by systemic corruption. For everyone listening, Clara's journey is a breathtaking testament to the resilience of the human spirit. She is a profound reminder that our worth is not defined by our circumstances, our bank accounts, or the powerful people who try to keep us small. Clara walked into a gilded cage and systematically dismantled a criminal syndicate from the inside out, never once sacrificing her soul or her empathy. She teaches us that true power does not come from holding a gun or manipulating the law, like Victoria Sterling or Robert Hayes did. True power comes from the boundaries we set, the unshakable belief in our own value, and the mercy we choose to show in the face of absolute cruelty. Clara did not just survive the dark, she became the light that exposed it. On the other side of that coin, Julian's arc offers a staggering lesson in redemption and the true nature of love. We often see society romanticize the untouchable billionaire, the man who rules with an iron fist and destroys everything in his path. But the true romance in this narrative lies in his ultimate abdication. Julian did not win Clara by dominating his enemies or locking her away for her own safety. He won her by surrendering his toxic power. He traded his entire criminal empire, his unfathomable wealth, and his untouchable status just to stand before her in the evening chill as an equal. Julian's sacrifice teaches us that you cannot truly love someone while holding them captive, whether that cage is made of iron bars, manipulative contracts, or $2 million diamonds. Love is not ownership. True love demands absolute equality, mutual respect, and the terrifying vulnerability of laying down your armor. Julian had to lose his kingdom to realize that the only thing worth keeping was his humanity. In our own lives, we may not face mafia bosses, assassins in the night, or corrupt politicians pulling the strings of our destiny, but we all face systems, environments, or relationships that try to dictate our value. We all experience moments where we must choose between the easy path of self-interest and the incredibly difficult path of compassion. Clara and Julian's story reminds us that true freedom is only found when we refuse to compromise our integrity. It shows us that even the darkest, most broken hearts can be saved when they finally step out of the shadows. The greatest victories are never won with violence or manipulation. They are won with the quiet, radical courage to respect human life, to demand equality, and to love without conditions. This content is manually researched, built, and edited to bring meaning and lessons.